Welcome to the BrettJohnson.biz podcast, where we discuss business on purpose, radically fresh leadership, capital that transforms society, and marketplace stories that embolden difference makers. Well, welcome to the Repurposing Business podcast. My name is Brett Johnson, and I'm here with my good friend, Vernon Hyndman. Vern, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here.
Good should be calling you Dr. Vern nowadays, which is amazing. And I met Vern some years ago, and we're starting a series now where the tables are being flipped, and my guests are going to interview me. And one of the things that's exciting when you write a book is that somebody like Vern reads it and then thinks about all sorts of things that I didn't even think about when I wrote the book. And it's fun because we keep unpacking the topic together. And Vern, we've been doing that for some time now. When did we first meet?
It was a long time ago. What I find, if I find something that is that changes my life, that gives me a new paradigm, I tend to I find the author. I track them down, and you were a little tough to track down. I tried to find you in California, and you had gone to Tennessee, and I got to you from California through South Africa, eventually in Tennessee. It was a long time ago. It was in 2015 or so.
Okay, great. And at the time, Vern, I know you were doing some work at a university. Then you introduced the university into the Lemon Leadership Model, and it's went from there. You've gone on to do other things. So you've thought a lot about this topic of leadership. Why don't you tell us just a bit about your background, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, and you're in the driver's seat.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm on my third career. I've been married. Shelley and I have been together almost 45 years, and I'm a grandpa, and I watch my kids trust me with their newborn, if you can imagine. So I watch little ones these days. I'm on my third career. First career, I was a biomedical research engineer in anesthesia. And we studied the autonomic nervous system back in the late 80s, I guess. And as a result, we were on the internet before the internet. We were on the internet before the browser was invented. And so I spent another a career as a network engineer, early internet entrepreneur and network engineer, and major life change. And now I'm an interventionist. So I help people on they call me the pastor of disaster. So if you're if things are going badly, I show up, which doesn't always make them better.
Yeah. Great.
By the way, I give away the book by the case. I buy them by the case.
Yeah. Fantastic. That's great. And you're up in Pennsylvania, right?
Yes.
Awesome. Great. Fantastic. And I just learned a fun fact about you, that you take a cold plunge every morning in a spring on your property. You must be nuts.
Well, it's in our town, 22 million gallons at 55 degrees. I go up to my neck, even in the snow. And coffee is optional after that.
Fantastic. Well, I might be sticking to my coffee, but that's great. So, Vern, it's good because I don't know what you're going to ask me today, but it's going to be fun. We're going to talk about lemon leadership, and we'll discuss some things that we haven't even talked about before. So I'm looking forward to this. Over to you.
Absolutely. So I've looked at some various management, the Enneagram, and some of these other modalities that we learn about humanity, ourselves, and other people. And I'm really interested to know more about, with Lemon Leadership, it seems to get to some atypical leadership styles. Tell me about how it came about, and also what you found in terms of atypical, like for instance, I know it supports female leadership in a way that others don't. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Without recognizing that this would be coming down the road many years ago, I was involved in a local church and had to deal with some leadership issues. There were some serious leadership problems. And with that, a local guy challenged me and said, if you were part of a big denomination, you wouldn't have these problems because I have a bishop and the bishop has an archbishop or whatever. And so I had to question, is the validity of a local church that's not part of a denomination actually real? Is it legit? And so forth. So I went about writing the history of this local church that I'd inherited. Along the way, I became pretty convinced that there's a construct of plural leadership, which has a group of people leading and a leader among equals. And it's not a hierarchical leadership, which you find in many corporations, churches, nonprofits, and so forth. And when you go through an election cycle, there's this delusion that the CEO or the president or somebody's going to be the answer to world tension. Whereas actually in the old Hebrew culture, they had a quorum that was 10 people. You couldn't make big decisions that would impact the village or the town or a funeral or a marriage without a quorum. And I learned along the way that there's this construct of plural leadership. Yet, as I was building executive information systems, and this was a new discipline in about 1981 onwards, we would try to design a system for a CEO, which meant we had to study leadership. And when I studied leadership, all of the literature said there's two types of leaders. There's entrepreneurs and managers. And then they would get nuanced and say, well, there's the general managers or the this. And then when they couldn't fit anybody into that category, they said, oh, they're a visionary, And so, but as I worked more and more and actually got into some project situations where I was working with experienced leaders who had a good set of values, there was a fairly common purpose. But I would get into a meeting and a week later, it was as if we'd been in a different meeting. And so I thought, well, they're not lying. They must be seeing something that I don't see. They must be seeing something differently. And the entrepreneur manager boxes, the two boxes, just didn't cut it because I began to see by observation that actually there were more types of leaders, not their styles, not their, their direct, indirect, analytical, intuitive. I knew all of that stuff. I'd built computer models to do the DISC assessments and so forth back in the mid-'80s. But I found, they just, even though I'd done all of that stuff, I realized that the categorization of entrepreneurs and managers was way too narrow. And there were people who fundamentally saw the world differently, acted differently, had a different definition of work. They spoke a different language, actually. And so I began to codify that and then test it with leader after leader. And then some years later, I wrote the book. Yeah.
Oh, and thank goodness you did. That leads into the next question. When you kind of engage the book, there's maybe three movements, large movements, at least as far as I mentioned. The first movement is what are the slices, which you define very, very well. And you say, in order to get anything done, you really need to have all five. Otherwise, somebody's going to have to do something they're not good at. There's the first one is the descriptive part. And then the next part is what do the slices do when they don't get what they need, which is revolutionary. I tell people when I give the book out, you're going to put people's names beside these things, because you know these people already. And then the final part, which I thought is really helpful, is translate. You just mentioned the linguistic part, translating across the slices and being able to talk to people in their native language, in their native slice language. So, can you talk to me a little bit about what you've experienced with rolling this out in places? How have you refined that, and how has that have you seen that affecting communication and the ability to keep the positivity of a thing together?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think as I tried to explain lemon leadership to people, I thought a bit about the analogy of a lemon tree, and because it fits quite easily, if you like. And so if you look at the roots of the tree, you can say these are the characteristics of each type. And we've all got 5 roots. It's not, I've never met anybody who only has 1 root. I mean, I have met a few people who look like they're very shy on the others, but they've still got a taproot. But so I say the roots are like the characteristics. Then if I look at the core of the trunk of the tree, if you had to follow that analogy, and you could say to yourself, well, the trunk of the key is like the being. How do they actually, in terms of their characteristics, how they operate and so on. So then you can get up into the branches and so forth, and I look at how they operate, how they communicate, how they even celebrate things, the fact that each likes to be rewarded differently and so forth. And then at the top of the tree, you get to some of the more nuanced things where you look at things like, okay, how do they envision things? How do they think about issues like justice and legacy and so forth? And so you've got those higher type qualities that people think about, which is great. And that's nice. So if you say to yourself, okay, great, there's like these, how do they give? How do they think about purpose? What do they think about diversity and plurality and all of these things? And so you go from the characteristics at the bottom to the strengths, the weaknesses, what they do, what they protect, and then how do they build, how do they communicate, how do they deal with conflict, and then up into the more mature things. And then I find that there's a couple of things that they avoid, which you alluded to in the middle. And part of what they avoid is bringing alignment, dealing with conflict and so on. And then sometimes, there can be the dark side of things where they don't see things, they don't want to confront, or they deal things in a negative sort of way. So for me, broadly, the build out of the lemon tree helps explain all of these components somewhat. I don't know if that's useful.
Oh yeah, that it is for me. All of what you're saying is so true. It excuse me. It provided some predictability in relationship. So it often I say when you're in a kitchen, the smaller the kitchen, the more likely you're going to get an elbow in the ribs. And and you think about these. Start out with an organization, it gets tighter over time, and the likelihood you're going to get crossways is higher. And if you have these tools, it becomes more predictable, and also the route out becomes more predictable to me, and that has been very helpful.
Yeah.
Before I forget, one of the categories you talked about talking about this morning that I love, Stephen Pressfield, the guy that wrote he has wrote a golfing movie a while back. He had a book that became a movie, and he has a book called the War of Art, and he wrote a companion book, which is much so. War of Art, it's a heavy read, it takes a while to read it. It's a wonderful book, but he wrote a much smaller book called Do the Work, which you can read in a really short period of time. It's maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and it has the nut of what's there. And so one of the things you asked, what could we be doing? One of the things I thought of is the companion book for Lemon Leadership that I could hand out. I give this book out regularly, and I buy it by the case and I give it out. And I do know that people are generally overwhelmed a bit, and when I give the book out, I would imagine about 30% of the time people read it.
Yeah.
And the ones who most need to read it are the ones least likely to read, unfortunately. And I'm thinking,
I was staying in somebody's house and I found a Lemon Leadership book on their shelf. So I took it off, and on page 100, I wrote, when you get to this page, call me. They haven't called.
No.
Yeah. So are you
No.
advocating that I do something like a Lemon Light or something like that?
Yeah, a companion book so I would like to be able to give it. I want the message is the point. The book's wonderful, but the message is the point. The what's under it is the point. It's the awareness, and it's the living out of it that is the point to me. And so efficacy in getting the message out is important. And These videos are really good. They're a different modality and they help. And also, I've really enjoyed the cohorts that you've done, the learning cohorts.
Yeah.
Talk to me about so one of the things that people may or may not know is that this is a worldwide thing. It's probably even more. It's very popular in Africa and India. I know. So
Yeah.
talk about the international part of it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I'm often surprised when I will bump into people and they'll tell me that they've been working with Lemon Leadership. And this isn't international to you, but I got an email yesterday from somebody directing sales and marketing in a company in Iowa. The day before, I got off the phone with the founder of the business. There's a group of 11 companies, and he was the founder of the group. And I dug back in my emails, and he'd emailed me in about 2013 or so. And since then, I've found that they've got about 200 copies of the book. Every department goes through it. They have weekly conversations around the chapters, which I had no idea about. They didn't know about the online assessment. So they said sometimes out of the little checklist at the end of the back chapters, people get themselves wrong. I said, have you ever taken the assessment? They're like, what assessment? So it's interesting where it does pop up. And yeah, so in South Africa, it was on the bestseller list when it came out in leadership books. It was distributed by somebody else out here for a while. And certainly we have trained facilitators in many parts of the world, and we've worked with us in Indonesia, in India, as you say, in probably South Korea. I've spoken at Tsinghua University in China on this topic. And in fact, when I went to do so, there was a UC Berkeley professor the day before I went to listen in on his lecture, because he and I went over together. And he stood up and said, there's two types of leaders, entrepreneurs and managers. And my job the next day was to be respectful to him, and the students had taken the assessment and they looked at the 5 types, and so it was one of those things. But the poor professor wasn't going to get his PhD unless he signed up for just 2 types of leaders. Yeah,
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, that's embarrassing. Because when I did the book early on, I OCR'd that part of the book, and I produced a spreadsheet that would do a mini assessment because I was totally unaware of the assessment. And I think I sent it to you, and you're like, yeah, you might want to, we have this thing. I like your spreadsheet and everything, but we have this thing that's a little better than a spreadsheet. You might want to look at that. Also, the assessment part, as with everything else, there's a personal assessment, and then the group assessment, which we did, very helpful. When I was doing my master's down in Tabor College in Wichita, is an entrepreneurial ministry master's, and as soon as I started, I introduced the guy leading, and from then on, every cohort went through it. Because it became an obvious tool for them. But they also did the group cohort. It was really helpful to know who you're traveling with,
Yeah, that is where I think a lot of the value comes. We've seen it in groups, we've seen it in families and so forth. But when you look at the group dynamics, I mean, I've had some companies I've worked with. One was a university, actually. We ran the assessment. And when we got all of the leaders together, there were no luminaries and entrepreneurs. Now, the university had been started by luminaries and entrepreneurs. And as they looked at each other, they said, well, who's missing? And it was these guys. And why were they missing? Because they'd hired a manager from IBM, a serious manager. And he started putting policies and procedures and processes in place, standard operating procedures. And the luminaries and the entrepreneurs just fled for distant islands. And so it was quite interesting. And so when you get the group result, you can see what's going on. I had another client in the San Francisco Bay Area, high-tech company, and they were convinced, all of them, that they were organizers and managers, basically. But their results were coming back, luminary, networker, entrepreneur, and so forth. But they didn't believe the results. And the situation was quite unusual. A very strong CEO. He was the founder CEO who had lots of ideas. And they felt their job was simply to implement what he came up with. And so one of the guys came to me at the break, and he was a mathematician. And he said to me, E minus R equals L. I said, what does that mean? He said, well, entrepreneur minus risk equals luminary. He said, I used to be an entrepreneur, but I've lost my willingness to risk, or the environment took away his willingness to risk. And so now he thought about stuff instead of actually doing stuff.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great story. That is so accurate. I think with even, we have Lemon for Lovers, you have these other books that are helpful relationally. And even my wife and my wife is a hardcore manager. She had, at one point she had 400 employees in a $100 million budget. Yeah. Nobody in their right mind would ever give me that. Like it would be just a nightmare. We'd be in the wilderness somewhere. But because she's ticked and tied and centered, and my luminary part was really irritating to her.
Yeah.
Just really. And so if you don't have, so one of the things that I've appreciated about the categories, the slices, is it validates the slice to say, this is really different, but not wrong. And that part, I think, has been, that's a big part of it. You mentioned some of this came out of the church, and I think churches are hospitals where the patient runs the place, and sometimes they can be dysfunctional as a result, and you want to think that churches are going to be these places that are functional, but we bring ourselves as we are, and we progress from there. And so I think I've seen you've mentioned a couple of contexts that have been. What are the stranger contexts that you've seen Lemon flourish in?
Yeah. Look, I will say in the church context, to close out on that, what happens is we like to put things in religious boxes. So I was once doing something with a bunch of experienced missionaries. This was leadership. And I went through Lemon Leadership, and the lady said to me, well, I must be a luminary because I've been a Sunday school teacher for so many years. I'm like, no. You're a Sunday school teacher. So, you can be a manager as a Sunday school teacher. So what we'd like to do sometimes is to say, well, prophets are luminaries, or are they entrepreneurs, and so forth. There's a parallel between fivefold ministry and Lemon only from the perspective of plural leadership, which goes back even bigger, that construct I mentioned earlier. But there's not a one-for-one mapping, because if you say, there were 12 apostles, fine. Let's have a look. Well, Paul, if you add on a 13th plus, he's a luminary. He's talking about stuff, and he has the traits of a luminary. So when I read the Bible and Paul says, look, this is my opinion, and if anybody disagrees with me, they'll eventually come around. I'm like, yeah, that's a luminary, And, this isn't God's opinion. This is my opinion, but you can take it as God's opinion. There's a luminary who's talking about stuff, whereas you look at a guy like James, who's a diehard manager. Peter's probably like an entrepreneur who jumps into all sorts of things and gets into trouble. Then you look at somebody like Andrew, who's a networker, and so forth. And so, well, they're all apostles. Yeah. And some did more of teaching, and some did more of administration, and so forth. But so in the church context, I think it's freeing for people, because otherwise, the people at the top think, I've always got to be leading. No, sometimes you just got to figure out who should be leading, get out of the way, let them get on with their job. It can take the pressure off people. I've also seen situations where, people get promoted to become a manager, but they're not managers. And so it kills them. Or the smart ones figure out how to manage out of their Lemon slice or their Lemon identity. So I have a friend, Joe, who was promoted to manager of an IT support organization in a bioscience company. And we ran an assessment, and most of his employees were organizers, and he's a luminary. And he thought, well, I don't want to do like weekly reports and all of the manager type of things and manager meetings. So how would he do it? And he knew that organizers didn't like to be controlled. They don't like to be told what to do. They like to be just empowered to do what they do. So Joe was super smart. And so he gave every one of his team a credit card, a company credit card, and said, you can solve any problem up to $2,500. And then if you got a really big problem, come and let me know. And so they got on with it. They were empowered. He wasn't sitting there trying to have management meetings and write management reports and so forth. He could think about the bigger things around the department and so forth, solve bigger problems. And then, most of these people, when they got to a problem bigger than 2,500, they turned it into 2 problems and they still solved the problem. So, yeah, but there's a good example of somebody who understood it. And then there are other people who don't understand it, and it wears them out when they're working inconsistent with how they're wired. Yes. But to your point about the validation, I was working with a company up in Marin County, north of San Francisco, up in an old George Lucas film studio, actually, where they did the original Star Wars stuff and so on. And we did a session with the group, and at the end, we went around and just asked everybody, what did you get out of this? And there was the last guy to answer was a rabid luminary. I mean, he was a real amazing guy in the field. And he said, I feel relieved. I thought I was the only one who thought the way I did and so forth. And he realized there's a whole category of people. Not a huge percentage, but there's a whole category. And I think he felt relieved. He said, I'm not crazy. Yeah.
Yes. That also happened for me. One of the things I've from your work, one of the things that, luminaries are ahead. And, people get offended when you say they're ahead, just think you're, different, smarter, or whatever, but it isn't like that. But there's an interesting latency. I had a recent conversation with a friend when we were in our earlier in our doctoral cohort. I had a conversation with him about how he might position what he was doing, and he didn't hear it at all. 8 years later, we have a very it's intense right now. We're doing exactly the same thing we talked about 8 years ago, which was innovative at the time. Yeah. So for me, sometimes having that measuring the latency is helpful for me to know how far out. So for me, it's not how far out I can go, because I can go a ways out. My thing is, how close can I get to reality? I'm about 8 years out right now.
And that's really good to know. So one of the comments you made when you reviewed the book, This Land is Your Land, This Land is My Land, is you said, Brett, this is going to be an issue in the States 10 years from now, I think you said. And, you were right. Back then it was a non-issue, this issue of land expropriation, who was on. And you've seen the cases start to bubble up, and it is becoming more of an issue. And it's a bit unsettling when you can see something out there. But as you say, once you figure out your latency, it can prevent you from getting bored, because this is why luminaries die poor, because they're bored with their own ideas before they become economically viable. And then some other guy, who will do the farming and the plowing and the watering, makes money out of it.
Yes.
And so being able to stick with your own ideas long enough until people are ready to hear them is really, really important if you're a luminary.
It is. It also helps you not do damage. My primary thing is I don't want to hurt anybody. I don't want to cause dissension. And knowing how far out I am gives me an idea of how to work with that. I love This Land is Your Land. I was hoping to talk about that a little bit. When you said you'd written a book about that difficult topic, and I hadn't read it yet, I'm like, ooh, do I really want to read this thing? Is it? I loved it. So innovative, and so relational. I've recommended that book, maybe a little more sparingly, because people have to they have to be ready to address things differently. But you found, when you talk about the third way of Jesus, you really that was a brilliant strategy, and I think it is the way. The way is relational. The way is reaching across boundaries, and I love that book. I would recommend that to anybody.
Yeah. What's interesting, Vern, is that this last week, like in the last 10 days anyway, the president of South Africa signed land expropriation without compensation into law. Now he's going to get some pushback, and it's a political move, but I think I wrote that in 2018 or so. So you got 2018 to 2025, and some of these things just take time to percolate. And the long time horizon of a luminary can be frustrating. But if you understand, like if you're married to a manager, she's got a shorter time horizon. And if there's an organizer in the mix, then they just have such shorter time slices, and one has to take that into account,
Yes. Yeah, as you mentioned that, you wrote from the perspective of this issue's coming, we can deal with it differently. There's this third way we could look at, and you've said it's been signed into law, which means now we have to write from a different perspective. Okay, you're going to be living on expropriated land. How does that work? There's with churches, when churches have splits, even if it's for good reason, when they have splits, they're always flavored by the split, even decades later. Unless something happens and they're able to get rid of the vestiges of why they split, it's hard to get. And I think when you have movements in political movements in countries, even if something happens that might favor you, how you embrace that and recognize that other people are impacted by it. The luminary has a role in that. You've done that. Jesus said, "I go to prepare a place before you," and that's a luminary statement. It's like we're going to be there when you get there. We'll probably have coffee for you, but we'll have thought it through. We'll produce these things of such value. Yeah. But luminaries can't. You have to have the other slices. The fact that you create the awareness, you've elevated, so you've really supported women. I think about the church environment, the first two Christian evangelists were women. The first one was Anna at Jesus's circumcision, and then the second was a woman at the well. And we forget those things, and Lemon is a return to that. It's, hey, the gospel flourished as a result of this, of all of the people, and they're all leaders.
What I like about Lemon is that when you've got to focus on the type and not on the gender. I mean, what we should be doing with the kingdom of God is thinking about a bigger culture in town. And the bigger culture in town was there's neither slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, male nor female, and so forth. And there was a serious empowerment of women. And I think that the church has got a bad rep for, quote unquote, keeping women suppressed. Whereas if we look at scripture and the fact that in the Old Testament, there were women prophets, there were judges who were running countries, they were not just speaking to power, they were power. And then in the New Testament, we see how they're funding the work of Jesus. They become his VC type of thing. And then he elevates them through the teaching, through the recognition, and so forth. And then
always
into the New Testament, it's just amazing and empowering thing. And yet what I find in the Lemon leadership model is that there are more women who are organizers and networkers than there are men. And if you think about the glass ceiling, and if we say, well, entrepreneurs and managers are men, well, there happen to be more, those are the leaders, and there happen to be more men who are those things. When you're a woman, you've got a higher probability of being deemed to not be a leader in traditional leadership models. You're a supporter, you're a helper, you're a promoter, you're something. But no, in the lemon leadership model, you're a leader, and sometimes the CEO needs to be a networker. Sometimes the CEO needs to be an organizer. You know, I was working with a Kaiser Permanente hospital in the San Francisco Bay Area, ran an assessment on a group of people, and nearly all of them were organizers. So these were physicians, PhD physicians, and so forth. And they were the ER department. That's what they were. And that's what you want. You want organizers in the ER department. You don't want a manager or a networker or a luminary running the ER department, or a or an entrepreneur treating the person with the most money. I mean, you really need to have that. And so there's times when, the CEO should be an organizer, not say,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And what's really interesting is it's borne out in the cohorts. Like, as I engage the cohorts, I'm engaging women who are across the spectrum of the lemon, and they're empowered. There's not a sense of timidity in that. There's an empowerment in that. So all of what you're saying is borne out as I engage the people that surround you. So there's a continuity of that's helpful.
Yeah, we have one couple that I got to know some years ago, and I work quite closely with them. So he's an organizer, she's a manager. She'd done quite a bit of nonprofit work and so forth, and he's a super capable guy. He does data analytics, he does all of the stuff, and he's an organizer. So when they go to run a small group for the church in their home, say, he's feeling the pressure to be the leader because he's the man. She's better at it than he is. And when we went through Lemon Leadership, he was hugely relieved because it took the pressure on. I mean, she just happens to be more competent in this area. He's more competent in other areas. And instead of him feeling, disempowered or neutered or something like that, he thought, oh, that's great. I mean, she can flourish in this environment. She does it easily. She does it with one arm tied behind her back. I do better in these things. And it's better for both of them. It takes pressure off him, freeing for her. She's not there sitting thinking, there's a better way to do this, but I better shut up because I'm the wife. I mean, it's stupid. So if we understand the lemon thing and we layered that in, if we looked at every leadership team, every situation, and we weren't so focused on, we need to have 2 women on the board, or we need to have that. It's like, we need to have, for me, you've got to have a mix of the lemon slices. And skill sets that go with it. And you're going to find that there's going to be men and women in that mix.
Absolutely. So you kind of prompted a bit for maybe an assignment, or what to do next. And one of the things that really, because I love this work, I sometimes call it fondly a blunt instrument, because it has enough. It's simple but not easy. It's this thing that works so well. It's elegant. So one of the things that has hit me over the last while, and it's some of the work that I do, and I would love to encourage you to consider it. Once you understand the slices and how they interact, what the process by which a luminary invests in their luminariness, how do they mature into that, and how do they build their gift and respect it and build it and whatever. And so same for each of the slices. The way they do that is radically different. And it would be really interesting to have a book about, once you've established the areas that you're centered in, it would be really interesting to have a book that talks about maybe a few things. One is, what does it look like to enhance this gift? How do you mature this gift? What are the contexts you do that? What are the educationally? How do you do that? And then also, what are the risks. Each one of them has a different sickness risk. Each one of them has a different, you're going to experience these difficulties. It's natural for this, but it's really difficult. What does the healing process look like? So for me, it would be really interesting to have the next layer of,
Yeah.
Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. Look, I take your point that I think lemon is simple, but it's not simplistic. So it's simple in the sense that, a child can understand it if you explain it to them. I've had 5 and 7-year-olds discuss with their parents whether their discipline is appropriate because they have different
Yes.
lemon sizes, which is fair. And so it's easy to understand from that perspective. I think you're getting to some of the nuanced points, like how do you grow the different types of lemons? I think that's a good thing. I've thought about getting have a luminary weekend, get a bunch of luminaries together, because then you can say, okay, you need to watch out for these type of situations. I mean, the world has been ruined by luminaries who are set on a wrong idea.
Yes.
They can wreak havoc in society with bad thinking, and that has long-ranging implications.
Yes.
And they're so set on a particular thing. And we see some of that going on in the world today with people who claim to be scientists or philanthropists or this or that, but they work off a bad idea that has big implications. And it's worse when they've got money. So, because you can amplify the stupidity or the fault.
Yes.
You can spread darkness at the speed of light. So I like the idea of getting different things. In fact, when we did a Lemon for Lovers session here once, we did a day workshop, and we put the people together in groups of who's married to a luminary, who's married to an entrepreneur. And Lynn was walking around, and she walked past the entrepreneur group, and you had a bunch of people in the entrepreneur, and the one would say, oh, I got home and my husband had sold the car because he needed the money for this or that. The other one would be, oh, that's nothing. Mine sold the house, And and they were laughing, they were crying, but you can unpack these things. I mean, I know for myself as a luminary manager, if I look back over the last 40 years, I mean, I did some things because I was convinced this was the right thing to do.
Mm.
But man, as a parent, as a father, as a business leader, but some of it came out of my luminariness, unchecked by or not recognizing enough of the other thing. And so I do think that, how do you lean into your second slice is key for me. So if you're a manager networker, I mean, you have a second slice to soften or round out, to lean into from your first slice. And when people get so stuck in their first slice, you can see this among professors. I'm sure you've seen it in academia and so on. They can only talk about this narrow field. They're relationally clueless. They don't know what people are feeling. They disconnect and so on. So I think that understanding your second slice, not just to mitigate the weaknesses, but how to lean into the strengths and to get your first and second slice to work together is really, really important. For me, the hardest thing, Vern, is each can be hard to grow if you don't understand the concept of offense and there is a need to grow. So what I've discovered is that each of the lemon types gets offended differently. So, and the scripture says, we're not unaware of the devil and his schemes. Well, one of the schemes of the devil is to offend us, but he offends a networker differently from a manager.
Yes.
And, if your wife is a manager and you mess with her systems or the way she set up something to do and you disregard it, you pretend you don't see it, she can get offended, right? But if your friend's a networker and they introduce you to somebody, then you have a party and you don't invite the networker. And so you take their network and so forth, and it can be worse. So for me as a luminary, I sat in bed one day and I was thinking about a situation where I proposed to leaders in a country that they tackle a certain issue around capital in a particular way in their country. Otherwise, it was going to be a problem years down the road. And they listened to me, and one of them stood up and said, look, this is our problem, not your problem. This is our giant, not your giant. Now go back to America. He didn't say it quite that bluntly, but it's sort of what he was saying. And I realized a while later I'd got offended by that because they rejected the idea, the solution that I was offering. And then I began to think through, well, how does an entrepreneur get affected or a manager? So,
Yeah.
so I've got to know, because offense will prevent growth. So I think
Yes. Yes.
good point. Yeah.
Yeah, that is so true. We have a saying, expectations are premeditated resentments, and so it lowers the expectation. There's a difference between expectations where are very specific and unspoken versus living expectantly, which says, I think you've got something good for me. I'm not sure what it is.
Yeah.
It's very open. You mentioned education. If education doesn't make you more curious, you wasted your money,
Yeah.
and so the idea of curiosity and all this, as a luminary, I'm used to my life. Most of my life, I recognize that people are only getting a portion of what I'm telling them. They're
Yeah.
maybe 5 or 10%.
Yeah.
And so often I'm telling them something I know they don't see. And sometimes they see it very clearly and they know I'm wrong. And I don't know the difference. So I have to invite people into my life. I for 13 years now, I've every month I see a clinical psychologist, and part of his job is to tell me if I've lost it, because I won't figure it out for about 10 years. And so his job is, we have these conversations, and I tell him what's going on in my life, and he reflects for me. Or, am I tracking? Can he see me? Am I on a track that's healthy or not? So as a luminary, I have to specifically invite and sometimes pay for people that are going to temper the dark side of what I might do, so that I don't hurt people. You're so right. You can hurt a ton of people without thinking.
Yeah, Vern, you're right about that. I sat just recently with a guy who's a serious luminary, and he's considering a life partner who he marries. And he's thinking he wants somebody that he can talk to everything that talk about everything that he's thinking about. But the fact is, he's thinking about 20 topics. And I had to tell the guy, it's not going to happen. You can get a friend to talk about topics 1, 3, and 5. You can get somebody else that you're talking to about these things, but don't lay it on some poor lady that she's going to track with you across your 20 topics and so forth. You have to understand that in some respects, it's just not going to happen. And you have to figure out how you're going to surround yourself with a mix of people and not have expectations that people are.
Yes.
Many, many years ago, Lynn was in a ladies' prayer room. It was a bunch of the pastors at the church primarily and Lynn. And one of her friends said to her, I would much rather that somebody understood me than loved me. And Lynn was shocked because Lynn's got a lot of networker in him. And this lady is a classic luminary. And she was like, I'd rather you understand me than love me.
Yeah, you have to know that. Once you know, you can meet them where they are. And often God's gift to us is, a luminary might be given someone who won't listen to him at all. And because at what point does the fire stop, right? And so, you're burning, and at some point, maybe the person that you maybe an organizer is like, we're gonna have dinner, and could you park the ideas in the backyard for a tad so we can have dinner? Invite you into another median way between them. I don't make assumptions. God often puts people with the opposites. And
I like your idea about visiting people where they are. So go and hang out in organizer world for a while. Go hang out in networker world or manager world for a while and enjoy it. Don't critique it, observe it, see what they're doing, see how they're thinking and so forth. Appreciate it. Look for the gold, look for the glory, go in with expectation, just on the assumption that there are different things, there are different ways of doing things. So so I think that's really, really good. And we need to all take take visits to luminary land or networker land sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's, as you approach something, there's an inflection point and a moment of decision that most of us don't realize that there is a decision.
Yeah.
The decision is we can stop being a participant, which involves opinions, and it involves judgment, and it involves defensiveness, whatever. And we can be an observer, which you mentioned a minute ago. And the observer is just curious. How does all this work? And I can listen to all this without inflecting an opinion into it and changing it. I can listen to it and try and understand it and ask clarifying questions and come away with a deeper understanding. One thing before I forget, also, we talked about a potential subsequent work of how do you develop within your, how did you develop? And I think I love the idea of the groups, but a book also, I think having, but also what would be really interesting is a book of, it even could be fiction book, but a book of how does this play out in groups? Like, what does it look like? How does, I'm a writer, and I buy these thesauruses. They have a thesaurus of conflict, and they have a thesaurus of job description, or whatever. You buy all these thesauruses for fiction writing. And it would be really interesting to do character development around the lemon slices, and then write some even chapters of fiction of how this worked. If you had 12 chapters of different ways you've seen it happen. I know your brother has been very helpful, and he's a wonderful guy. He bright guy, just like you. And it'd really be interesting to even have a work of fiction that would wrap some pragmatic situations around it. Conflict, no story's any good without any conflict, right? So we could throw some conflict in there.
No, that's right. And it's a good idea to do a work of fiction, because then you can talk about people without talking about people. And,
right.
Yeah, which is great. I would enjoy that. I've only ever written one novel, and when I wrote it, then obviously there's some smatterings of truth in the whole thing, and people would come to me and say, "Am I that person in the book?" And one of the characters in the book was a lady called Edna. And then a lady who worked for me called Dina came to me and said, "Am I Edna? You've just mixed up the letters." It's kind of fun. I never admitted to it. But that would be fun to do. I like that idea, Vern. That's a great idea.
So one other thing with that is you also have this gravitational model of mentoring, and you are that. Gravity and gravitas work together, and you have gravitas in your life. You know that when people start orbiting your circle, and you have that, and so you have curated an incredible large group of people that I've been thankful to be part of. I'm really thankful to you, not only for your work, but for being included in contexts that I would never have been able to get to without your influence. And so maybe one of the other ways of doing that would be to invite people from your circle to write a chapter. And with the understanding that it would be edited by you and smoothed, but you could probably get a significant amount of content from a ton of people, because you're the gravitational pull of your life, the gravitas of your life is significant, and there's a ton of people orbiting you.
I like that. You give me ideas for about four or five different books. That's great. I love it.
I wonder if we just get a luminary on this call. If we could just get a luminary on this call.
That's right. That's right. Nowadays, I don't tell Lynn when I'm writing a book, because, she wants me to sell the ones I already wrote. That's her story. But recently she came to me and she said, "No, you have to finish writing a particular book." So now I'm on the hook with her. Yeah.
See, good for her. She's I'm excited sometime to spend, the interesting thing is your life has impacted mine significantly, and we've never met. That's the thing. I think that's kind of a heaven thing. I think
Yeah.
we're often going to run into people that have changed our trajectory and added and enhanced our lives, and it isn't. Maybe we don't get that chance. I hope at some point that happens.
Yeah.
We
That's
need to have a
wow. I
lemon
was just yeah,
conference.
I was just sitting here thinking we haven't actually met in person. How about
Right.
that? Yeah.
We need to have a lemon conference. There needs to be an international lemon conference. I think maybe in Johannesburg we could have a lemon worldwide conference, and
We
show
might
up
have to
and
choose somewhere like Bali or something like that.
there
But
you go.
I'm sure there's a lemon grove somewhere that'll take us. Yeah. Yeah, fantastic. Vern, that sounds amazing. Vern, were there any other things on your mind that you thought, man, I wish we talked about this or that, or what about this, or how does this really work there as we head towards a close here?
Yeah, there's never a shortage of ideas for you in terms of listening to all that. But what for me, um, as you look back at the entirety of your work in this, as I look at Lemon leadership, and then I look at This Land Is Your Land, I'm like, that's an outflow of that. It's the same thing. It's
Hmm.
it's a practical example of what happens when you live in your slice. Um, as you look back at an entire career of leaning in and helping people, what's the thing? What are some of the things you're most proud of?
Hmm. Wow, that's a good question. I think what I enjoy, and somebody, a CEO or COO of a company once observed this. He said, Brett, I've figured you out. You enjoy it when you see truth applied, actually put into
Mm,
practice. And I think that could come out of how I'm wired from a lemon perspective. I'm a luminary manager, so I'm not okay just with the thoughts unless it's put into practice and you've got those combinations. So I would say when I see people who are actually living out the stuff that has flowed out of the experiences, good, bad, and so forth, that I've had, and they've been able to get further, do more, have a better marriage, have a better business, and so forth, because they've been able to take these truths, which, and there's nothing new under the sun. So these are not my truths, but take foundational truths and apply them in different situations, and then be further, which impacts their businesses positively, impacts their families, their marriages, their kids,
yes.
and so forth. I think to me, the fruit is, Bob Buford actually said, my fruit grows on other people's trees. And,
Yes. Yes.
and I think it's a good saying. And so for me, I would say I can't point to something where I can say, oh, yeah, I did this in my own career and I've built an empire. But I think that there are seeds and things that have been put out there that have impacted the lives of others, hopefully positively. And so I would say that, I don't know if proud is the right word, but I'm pleased when I see truth applied.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's an echo of what God's done in your life. It's filtered through your, but you see these echoes. It
Mm.
isn't a replication. It's an echo
Yeah.
of this work applied. That's really good. That I could see why you'd be.
Yeah.
I could see why you'd answer that way.
I once read a quote many, many years ago. It might have been in a book called Information Anxiety by Richard Saul Wurman. The guy who first came up with the yellow pages instead of an old telephone directory. So he was an architect. And I think it was him who said that the simple strive to be profound and the profound strive to be clear. And so for me, you can say, okay, well, this is leadership. And then you can boil it down to a simple model, 5 slices, a lemon, a child can understand it. It's great. Or here's an operating model for a business and it's the 10P model, 10 drivers of impact or whatever. And so I think taking complex things that I don't want to say we have a right for it to be part of our everyday lives, but just should be comprehensible and understood and made simple. I was just reading this morning how the religious leaders complicated access to the temple and everything. So Jesus goes and he turns over the thing. He frees the whole thing up. Blind and lame people come to the temple. He heals them, and the kids respond. The kids are like, "This is awesome," and they call him the Son of David. The kids do. They figure out who he is.
Yes.
The experts don't know who he is, and he just boils it down pretty simple. And so I love to be not simplistic, but to take that which should be truth grasped and applied and put handles on it so that people can be more
Yes.
and live better lives. Yeah.
Yeah. So the metaphor for me, for what you just said, is so true. I think of if you're going to grow tomatoes, you put a lattice behind it so it can grow. Otherwise, they end up on the ground and they don't do well. And with Lemon Leadership, the book, if the book introduces people to strange and new ideas they've never heard of before, it's going to fail. What Lemon Leadership does, as you read it, you're like, oh, I know that. Oh, yeah, I know that person. That person's in my life right now. I know that person.
Yeah.
And so it is a framework by which you can hang what you've known for some time. So partly it's a framework that affirms what you already know, but also because the framework puts things together, you can take these disparate areas of knowledge that you affirm, you look, yeah, I know that, that's absolutely true. Then it puts them in relationship to each other. And suddenly now we have, so when I say it's a blunt instrument, it's simple, but deep. You're not, I haven't got to the bottom of it yet. Every time I talk to you, I learn something new. I'm not to the bottom of it. And I've been in it for quite some time. Yeah. And it's wonderful. I get more curious, and I realize that I talk to you, talk to your brother, I talk to anybody that's really lived this out for a long time.
Yeah,
you can't help but learn things. And it's often not a new thing about the slice, whatever, but it's a new thing about how they relate or how they're tripped up or whatever. It gets deeper and deeper. So I agree with you. The framework's really, really helpful.
Now, most people don't know that we've actually created 5 assessments, not one. So they do the basic one. Then we have one on communications, on lovers, on work and operations, and then one on legacy. Because, people talk, oh, and I want to leave a legacy. Well, what does that look like? It looks different depending on what your slice is. Some people want the name of the building, some people want other things and so forth. So there's actually if you put all of those 5 things together, you begin, but you're fine with the first one. It gets you up and going. It's great. But there are other layers as you put it on, as you say. And so,
I had no idea. So with those other subsequent assessments, do they also work individually and in groups? Can you do a group assessment for Lemon for Lovers? Can you do a group assessment for Legacy?
Yeah, so for Lemon for Lovers, we've set up a class which Lynn and I recorded, which can be a self-study class, but it works well to get a group of people together. Different cultures, the men and women are happy to talk or not happy to talk, but there's a brief little thing, say we're talking about communications in marriage, then there's some applied learning exercises and so forth. So it's great for a group context like that. And then there's 2 assessments. You've got your basic one, then your lovers assessment. And what I see quite simply is this. If a guy is a luminary and he's married to an organizer and his primary assessment says that, and then when I get his lover's assessment and he still looks like a luminary, I know there's a problem. He's stuck in his own head. But when when he starts to look in his lover's assessment like an organizer, then the guy's adapting to who his wife is.
Right. And
it's there in the chart. It's pretty clear. Is the spouse making adjustments for the person that they're married to? Are they twisting? Are they dying to self? Are they serving this person? Are they entering this world? And the data pretty much tells you.
Oh, that's awesome. I have a metaphor for that in my own marriage. There's a moment of time where everything changed, and we've been together for 45 years. And this happened in the last 20 years. It may have been the last 15 years where there was a moment of change. It was before Lemon for Lovers, but I'm sure had we read Lemon for Lovers, I'd have got a different version of the same clarion moment. But there was a moment of how I dealt with a broken car and how Shelley dealt with a broken car. It was different, and both of our ways were important, but just not at the same time.
Yeah.
And recognizing that,
yeah.
I don't want to go too long. I'd love to,
Yeah. I think that's a great point. Your point about time. What do you need now? What does the situation need now? And because of the different views and so forth. And I've had to learn to adjust, because for me, crises aren't real crises. There are things you can think about over the long haul. But for Lynn, it's stuff that has to be done today, typically.
Yeah.
And so making those adjustments, just so important. So much conflict could be avoided. Yeah, very good.
Yeah. Yeah, I work around things. Shelley's car broke, and it would stall. She was a nurse. She's going from here to her hospital, which is about 10 miles away at that point.
Yeah,
and the car would stall 8 times. By the time she got to the hospital, she was livid. And I'm like, Shelley, you're angry at an inanimate object. And I would get in the same car. I would drop it in neutral. One foot in the brake, I would, keep the revs up, whatever, drop it in neutral, hit reverse. I could drive from our driveway to the hospital, not stall at one time. I work around it. And Shelley's like, yeah, but you got your left foot on the brake. You're not supposed to drive that way. I'm like, I'm not angry. There's that. And so I felt because I could do it, I felt, okay, well, my way's better. And however, I was driving a Volkswagen at that time, and if you in this Volkswagen, it wouldn't start every 4th time or whatever. And I read up and I realized that if you open the trunk, it'll start every time. It's a problem. It's an interlock problem. Once I know you can open the trunk, I'm not spending $1,000 to fix the trunk. I'm just going to open the trunk. The problem with my car, you have to know 6 of those. You have to be a rocket physicist to drive my car, because there's all these things you have to know to drive the car, because it doesn't work right. You get in Shelley's car and it works the way the factory said it should work, because she gets it fixed. And I was unable to see that Shelley's way, which is do it right, don't work around it, go get it fixed, had such validity, and my way created such chaos,
Yours sounds so exciting, though, Vern.
So ultimately, when we're sitting in a broken car, the conversation we now have is this the workaround time because I can do that? Or is it the get it fixed time called the record time because you can do that? Yeah. And we have to define what is the correct response. And when we decide on the correct response, therefore we've decided which person's going to lead. Because if it's a workaround, and that was an epiphany for us, because Shelley looked at my way as categorically wrong. You're the guy who does all these weird things to get around things, and it gives me the heebie-jeebies. I can't deal with it, and so now she really respects that, because I'm not trying to push it on her. I'm not trying to say you as well should work around things. I'm saying, no, this is my leadership moment. I'm gonna get the car from here to the hospital.
Well, what a great story! What a great illustration. Well, Vern, thank you so much for this conversation. I've enjoyed the questions. I've enjoyed the ideas. People are going to listen to this and say, man, you shouldn't put 2 luminaries in a room at the same time.
We got out of here in less than 2 hours. That's a miracle.
That's impressive. That's impressive. Yeah. Well, Vern, thanks so much. Appreciate it, and look forward to future conversations with you. And thanks for adding some to-dos to my book list.
You're welcome. It's always good to hang out with you, and I really appreciate you thinking of me and inviting me.
Yeah, and thanks for your thought partnership on this stuff. It's been wonderful. Greatly appreciated.